complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. Like talking about blue, red, man. Then you get to one side, and like messed up.
All right. Before I welcome my guest on, just a brief introduction, and after that, a word from our sponsor. As I've said before, I want to do a mini series on Israel Palestine. Probably be 5 or 6 episodes all in. This is episode 2, and I could think of few people better to discuss this topic than the venerable Thomas777. But before that, a word from Axios. All right, Thomas, welcome to the show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing very well. That Axios trailer is really something. We got Equilibrium, we got Jason Voorhees, we got that erstwhile vigilante in real life who sent some chomo to hell.
Yeah, that was produced by our mutual friend Dimes. And when he said that, I was
he definitely aims for the swings for the fences, as it were. I just wanted to say
he got exactly what I was going for.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. I'm hoping he offered his services as I kind of increase my range of content in terms of, you know, getting into more video. And yeah, he definitely sells itself. I just wanted to comment on that.
So anyway, man, I want to have you on to discuss Israel Palestine. I had AA on last week, but first I want to say the reason why I am kind of embarking on this project. I'll admit, at my kind of bone deep level, I'm an American isolationist. You know, I understand, right, that geopolitics has certain realities, right? You can't afford to be completely closed off. But when I look at a situation like Israel, my general thought is, you know, not my monkeys, not my circus. You know, whatever happens, happens. And so I didn't pay much attention to the war past the initial invasion. And then it was actually AA who did a long video with a friend of ours, Radlib, Stephen Carson, about it. And he put forth the argument that this is in fact the most important thing to be focusing on. And he really convinced me. And so I wanted to have you on to discuss really 2 things. One, Israel as kind of a continuation of the Cold War, right? How Israel kind of indexed with that conflict. And then also what the neocons did after the end of the Cold War, where they sort of tried to substitute Islam and Muslims in general as this kind of great civilizational enemy. So maybe it would be a decent idea to discuss the history of the nation of Israel as it regards that topic. And then also, if you can, if this isn't too broad, the history of Islam in modern times as it regards to the West.
Yeah, certainly. And just briefly, you know, I share your sentiment. I mean, how can I not? You know, I'm an old stock American. I'm Anglo Protestant, like literally, that's my heritage. You know, I live in Chicago, so I take it somewhat personally when people act like, "Oh, you're just pretending to care about this alien conflict." You know, nothing occurs in isolation in a globalized world. Okay, and that was the case during the Cold War as well, although the paradigm was somewhat different. At present, you can't talk about a conflict, particularly one that is, you know, 100% derived, you know, from the official ideology, and is premised upon, you know, kind of like the raison d'etre of that ideology. This idea that the survival of the Jewish people is perennially in jeopardy, and that no measure is too severe or too total, you know, to guarantee the posterity of not just the Jews as a people, but, you know, the Jewish racial state. Like you can't somehow extricate that from, you know, from any political ambition that you hold as important. Says this idea that you can just cut yourself off from it is asinine. So is and I'll get to the question in a minute. I'll directly respond in a minute, but also people are incredibly ignorant about Islam. Okay, they just are. They've got some. It's like one part like caricature, one part sort of provincial idea that these aren't quote white people. So why do we care about them? Islam is in civilizational terms, it holds monumental significance, and it continues to. Okay, so that can't be avoided. Secondly, Dar al-Islam has been targeted for destruction for the exact same reason the West has. And if you're sitting here kind of like cheering on the death of Muslims or saying you don't care about them, it's kind of like in that movie Apocalypto, there's a really poignant scene where these warriors have been captured by I suppose it's like the Aztec Empire, and they're literally like waiting in line to have like their hearts cut out by this high priest. It'd be kind of like you like making fun of the man in front of you and sort of like taking some pleasure in his demise, as if that's not what's going to happen to you too. I mean that doesn't mean you need to. That doesn't mean you need to take up the study of Islam or like want Muslims to immigrate to your country or. And for the record, Muslim immigration Muslims don't generally want to immigrate either. That's mostly part of it's bound up with the kind of constellation of NGOs that work hand in glove, with America and Israel. And, when these countries are slated for destruction and assaulted militarily, these quote unquote refugees are quite literally rounded up, and then assigned destinations to be sent to. So there's that. But I think like it's some kind of like good thing if this is what befalls Muslim peoples. There's something perverse about that and self-defeating.
Well, this is something
Finally,
that Stephen
like,
Carson brought up,
yeah,
right? Which is that really Islamic migration, especially to America, does not exist before George Bush. It was just not a problem.
No, it
and
doesn't.
So, on its very face, supposedly this this man waging some sort of holy war against the Islamic war, or as against the Islamic world, rather. He says one thing and does another, and that's generally something we see quite a lot from the neocons, and is something that I think is something that I noticed but hadn't quite put my finger on. But anyway, back to you.
What's awesome is and just let me drive this point home, and then we'll get to the topic at hand. A lot of these people that the regime has identified as ops also aren't even like quote Islamic as people think of them. The Assads, they're not just a ruling house. They're very much kind of they're very much representative, kind of like the ruling tribe of Syria, like modern Syria as it stands. They're not Muslim. They're probably occulted Christians. Regardless, they're in habit, in practice, in cultural practices, in literally their morphology and race. These are white people, okay, albeit of like an Asiatic culture. But it's like this idea that 1 billion people on this planet are all a bunch of kind of like, I think they think of like Pakistani refugees like leering at girls or something like that. That is what Dar al-Islam is, and everyone else adjacent, even people who aren't Muslims, in Iran and in Syria, whatever. It's really really ignorant, and it's not something you're basically taking at value what literally a Zionist media apparatus tells you if that's what you characterize these people. But moving onward, when I talk about the deep Cold War, what people need to understand is that not metaphorically, this isn't hyperbole. This wasn't just propaganda coming from NATO or coming from Israel. The Warsaw Pact literally was at war with Israel. Okay. It was totally adjacent to the Palestine Liberation Organization. These various other iterations of resistance, like the Abu Nidal organization, which for all practical purposes was based in East Berlin. The East Germans themselves, they refused to recognize Israel as a state, let alone atone for the quote Holocaust. The famously one of the leading East German intellectuals, or West German intellectuals, Dieter Kunzelmann, who was one of the leading, kind of Marxist-Leninists in West Berlin. He literally referred to the Israelis as Jewish pigs. He openly talked about, how the problem in the West was that, even communists who are otherwise doing everything right, they refuse to acknowledge the quote Jewish complex that's crippling the ability of socialism to advance itself. The Bader Meinhof gang like openly celebrated, the massacre of the Israeli athletes at Munich, saying that, okay, we're returning to serve now. There's got to be no pity for these people. We've got to show them no quarter. When this was very much open and above board. Okay, I'll add too that South Yemen was the only Marxist-Leninist Arab government that ever existed. Okay, and that was kind of a feather in the cap of the Soviet Union. Interestingly, today, in the ongoing Yemeni civil war, there's very obviously like a Russian client militia that flies the South Yemeni flag. Okay, and that's if you know the deep lore there, that's significant. But be as it may, Syria. Speaking of Syria, it very much in military terms and in kind of ideological terms for limited, although essential purposes, it's the state that East Germany built. Okay, and these tensions really never abated. Okay, I mean the Soviet Union came to some kind of concord after 1973, in part because they had to. I mean, famously, in my opinion, that was America's alerts. SACNORAD had reached DEFCON 3. Okay, I believe, owing to the technologies of the time, the existence of genuine parity, the state of war tech, such that ICBMs, replete with decoys and independently targeted warheads, and just the throw weight of those warheads, and everything else. This was even more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis approximately a decade before. And the Soviets had, as the IDF surrounded the Egyptian army and moved in for the kill, the Kremlin made it clear that if the IDF moved on Cairo, that they would intervene directly. And the Soviets deployed nuclear weapons, like theater-based nuclear weapons, to the port of Alexandria. They didn't marry those warheads to their launch vehicles, but that's where that famous quote comes on one of the Nixon tapes, where Nixon says, like, we can't blow up the goddamn world for these people, like these people meaning the Jews. That's what he's referring to. Okay, so it really playing brinksmanship in the Middle East in a direct way like that was something that the Soviets had to back away from. And that's really what underlay the Camp David Accords. The East Germans, however, like no such thing proceeded from that. Really until the last day, the East Germans were at war with the Jewish state, and even, that famous the examples are legion of the discrete instances of East German operations against Israel and against and against American targets based upon responding to American operations like within the Middle Eastern battle space. In 1986, that famous bombing of the discotheque in West Germany, the La Belle discotheque, killed some American soldiers. It was a known hangout for like American troops and their girlfriends, and it was carried out by the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine General Command, and in direct cooperation with the Stasi. And like after the this all came out after the wall came down, and there's direct contact between one of the operators who actually planted the bomb, and his Stasi handler, and immediately after the operation, these men were squirreled back to East Berlin, put into a safe house. And I mean, of course, the DDR government denied any knowledge of any of these things. But this literally went on until 1990. When obviously any vestigial communist elements stood down. But interestingly, Horst Mahler, who'd been legal counsel to the Baader-Meinhof faction, he resurfaced in public life, only a couple years after the inter-German border disappeared, and he declared his allegiance to the NPD. He was recently in the 2000s, or at least in the 2000s. I think he's out now, but he was jailed for quote Holocaust denial, by the Bundesrepublik. We saw this again and again. There was a core. This was like a core of the post 1989 German dissident right. The National Socialist right and adjacent elements. These guys almost exclusively came. I'm talking about at the leadership cadre level. They almost exclusively came from the East. Very few of them came from West Germany. All right, and it's not some sort of accident or something. And there's not some irony there. Like I remember when Mahler was on trial, reading all these kinds of breathless takes in British media, like, oh, what a cynic. How could he do this? It's like, this makes perfect sense if you understand anything about, kind of the dialectical process and what and kind of like what was possible within sort of like the European zeitgeist of the later Cold War. It's not just that these guys are scrupulously avoiding any discussion of Nazism or Hitler. It was that wasn't really feasible, within the paradigm that was then extant, relating to political outcomes and political warfare. And not that they were afraid to talk about that. Obviously, these were the same guys who were calling the Jews like Schwein, quite literally. It's that it didn't have a context, And when the wall came down, when the inter-German border disappeared, when we came to exist in all of us, in a planetary wide globalist regime, it became possible to talk about these things in terms that weren't just thought experiments, related to the meaning of National Socialism and what possible outcomes were in terms of resistance to the globalist regime. But that wasn't possible during the Cold War. So that's really what I'm talking about, okay? And that's also what people need to understand about Europe, and Europe remaining under occupation, and Europe and American Israel being the enemy of Europe, and contra Europe in large part being the enemy of Israel. I made the point in that post that you raised because it's something I'm writing about at length now because I think it's important. And also, people have asked me a lot that they want to understand kind of the nexus of causation between the Ukraine war and Israel's ambitions, in not just in theater where the Ukraine war is happening, but obviously within their immediate sphere of influence and what have you. Angela Merkel, I find myself defending her constantly because people are always saying like she was the worst Reichschancellor ever. She was she's such a traitor for this immigration concession. Merkel had no choice in like accepting those quote-unquote immigrants. Germany's not a sovereign state. The concomitant pressures of the indigenous cadres that sort of force these kinds of policies through, like under the tutelage and control of America, obviously, but also what is the official like ideological party line in Germany, and there was only one party in Germany about quote unquote racism and like not rejecting any immigration proposals that entail accepting more non-white peoples. Like Merkel, there's absolutely nothing Merkel could have done to stop that. And anybody who thinks that like she or any other chancellor like has the authority to do that, that's laughable. What Merkel could do was Merkel could create complex interdependence with Moscow, which moving forward would be the only way to liberate Germany and Europe from the Zionist yoke, but also would allow Germany to continue subsisting on a manufacturers-based value-added economy, which among other things has been destroyed by America and America's terrorist assault on its energy infrastructure. So what Merkel did when challenged was say, "Oh no, I'm taking Germany off nuclear power. You can't possibly be against that," which was a masterstroke. So that's what Merkel managed to accomplish. Okay, So fast forward to, the 2010s, America and Israel began waging an active war against Assad's Syria. Their proxies, as is, their kind of usual go-to proxies, being these murderous Takfiri extremists. Against all expectations, the Syrian Arab Army, they were operationally integrated with Hezbollah as well as with the armed forces of the Russian Federation in a way that wasn't thought possible. This terrible, thank God, quite literally. I mean, Syria prevailed in this incredibly bloody war to overthrow the secular, legitimate regime, headed by Mr. Assad. These Al Qaeda killers and these Takfiri psychopaths were soundly defeated. This empowered and emboldened Iran, as well as the entire Shia constellation of Shia power in the Near East, from Yemen to the Levant. The way Israel returned the serves by assaulting Russia in its own backyard, and that's why all of a sudden, the Zelensky regime, which has never been anything but, a criminal regime, a terrorist regime, that was insinuated by America and Israel in 2014, obviously. But this dramatic escalation of hostilities, that's what was the catalyst for it. And that's why I'm always saying you can't extricate these things from one another. These conflict paradigms, they're part of the same paradigm. And it's also why it's literally insane when people say that, like, to hell with Russia, like I'm a national socialist or I'm pro-white. You're literally supporting a Zionist war against Europe when you support Zelensky and Ukraine. And the fate really of Europe, as well as of Dar al-Islam, hangs in the balance. Not to sound melodramatic. So anyone who's engaged, you can't hide under your bed from this or say it has nothing to do with you or that you don't care about the damn Arabs or Ivans. That's great, okay? But then you don't get to bitch about the fact that you live under Zionist rule. You don't get to bitch about the fact that you're a minority in your own country. You don't get to bitch about the fact that speech codes cost you your job. Just if you're gonna play, kind of, I'm gonna be like Mr. Macho Goyim and pretend that I'm above it all as my cope. Okay, that's fine. But then you're basically being a white N-word. So act like one.
I think that's something else that's been interesting in this, right? Is just the question of like, well, where do your priorities lie? And I think that what we've seen really has been revealing from a lot of like just the USG establishment is it quite literally doesn't matter. I think is it Eric Prince who's the mayor of New York City, right? Well, what is his constituency on the ground, right? It's leftists in New York. But the moment the order comes down, he sends in the riot police to club students at Columbia or at NYU.
Well,
and
yeah.
We've seen that across the political spectrum.
Let's
right?
also let me insinuate too. I'll get back to you in a second because I'm going to get to this. That like little like knee on the neck move that Derek Chauvin was using this to subdue George Floyd. Like, you know what that is, don't you? That's like an IDF maneuver. Like, police departments are trained in arrest protocol and in management of detainees literally by IDF liaisons, because they're training the police to deal with what amounts to like a hostile population. So it's like and of course like SPLC and ADL, they liaise with the police to talk about how people like us are potentially problems, things like this. So yeah, you can't. That's another thing too. Like these, you're not in the game, or you're just a cretin if your notion is, oh, I hate those commie faggots at Columbia. Good, the police are beating up on them. And so you don't understand. Like if those. It's absolutely no significance like what those kids are about or what they think they're about. It's if those guys were a bunch of like National Socialist skinheads, the same thing would be happening, except worse. Like the issue isn't like who they are; it's like it's who they've identified as their ops. And it's the fact that they're mobilizing. Whether they're being ignorant about it or whether they truly understand the variables or not, they're mobilizing against Zionism, and if you do that, you get smashed.
I think that it's especially galling when you brought up, right, Derek Chauvin, but look at the Summer of Floyd, and how much of that was basically allowed to go on, that kind of lawlessness, because it was convenient to the regime. And there were sort of these like limp-wristed responses, like, oh, we can't do anything, we don't have the resources. But you see, right, and Greg Abbott, who I think is you know what, I like my YouTube channel, so I won't say what I think of Greg Abbott. But all of the riots that happened, in the Summer of Love, and as soon as there's this anti-Palestine movement on student campus or on college campuses, right? He sends in the Texas Rangers armed on horseback, to just like charge it like it's a fucking Napoleonic battlefield, right? They just had a cavalry charge. And
was it saying it's like something out of the Turner Diaries, like when you see these guys like Abbott or you see these guys like Hannity, they literally like go berserk and they start like pretending that they're like Urdu widows, like putting a curse on you or something. Like, we've got to destroy all of these savages, and they're like pretending to cry and stuff. It's really, really, really weird. Like, I mean, it's like that you can tell it's like these literally are guys trying to imitate the state religion or emulate like what amounts to kind of like the performative like mourning protocol of the state religion, but it's so like bizarre and alien and literally Oriental. They don't know how to go about it. So like it's like, what are you guys gonna do next? Like tear your clothes off or something? Like I don't.
Right,
Like it's
wear
not
like a sackcloth and ashes and throw, beat your breast or something.
Yeah, and put the curse of the evil eye on like all Muslims or something. Like I don't. So I mean, if you want to pretend like I don't care about those goddamn Arabs, it's like, okay, well then fine, man, go be a white N-word, okay? Like go and talk about how you're like a badass because you've got your like UFC and like your Pornhub, and you can be Billy Badass in your backyard is like above it all, But it's like if you're actually engaged as a white man, like this is stuff that is actually important.
One of the other things that I want to talk about, and this goes back to kind of my childhood, is setting up in the post-Cold War era, because you've mentioned that the American empire effectively has no reason to exist anymore. It came into its form to fight Ivan. And once that's gone, there's sort of this scramble for what is America. You hear the paleocons talk about this a lot. The guys like Pat Buchanan, after the Cold War ended, basically his argument was, all right, we're a normal country again. And very clearly, the neoconservatives said, no, that we are an empire eternally at war. And so there was this desire to create, and there are these goofy terms like the axis of evil, that basically is like China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran.
It's just like a grab bag, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's just everyone we don't like. But as a part of that, there was a ton of anti-Islamic rhetoric, that is essentially the great evil. And so one of the things I want to talk about is, where does the specter of Islamic terror come from? Because I'm no historian, right? But I look at America let's just say pre-1945, but it was, a little bit after that. And Islamic terror doesn't even exist. Islam, the Islamic world was seen as kind of a sleepy backwater. So where does this kind of canard come from? And then how is it used to basically provide a continual reason to exist for the American empire?
Well, it's interesting. The people in certain ideological corridors, the mad Arab assassin, like literally was always kind of a boogeyman. And when I made this point before, and people don't really understand what I'm talking about, I'm gonna answer the question directly in a minute. But Dar al-Islam was part of the Axis powers. Okay, the Mufti of Jerusalem, he was a committed National Socialist. Palestinian volunteers like did fight with the Wehrmacht. So there was that, this idea of like the Arab is a natural fascist. He's the quote anti-Semite. I mean, which like he is a Semite, so he's like anti himself. I never really understood that either. But in terms of the idea of like how this kind of entered the public mind, really what I think, three things really kind of put Islam on the map as a modern political and military actor. Okay, what those was it was the Iranian Revolution, obviously, and even though the Iranian Revolution was obviously like a Shia revolution, and I actually agree with Foucault on this, it represented more a third positionist tendency than a truly Islamic tendency. But that doesn't matter for our purposes. What matters is that the perception wasn't this is a quote Islamic government. It's demonstrated that an Islamic government is possible. It can establish itself, as the exclusive sovereign authority. It can maintain a modern army. It can preside over a modern economy, however crippled it may be by sanctions and other dysfunctions. Like in other words, like like Islamic government truly is possible is what it proved, and that changed everything. Secondly, was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the fact that thousands of mujahideen like literally answered the call of holy war to go fight the communists. Okay, nobody saw that coming. Like we've talked about before, kind of the sense in the 20th century was that religion's dead. It's never gonna have animating power anymore. It's never gonna really be a factor in modern politics. It's any appeal to it. It's just kind of an appeal to nostalgia or something. Um, you know, as we've talked about before, things like the Pope's visit, you know, um, to Poland, where literally like a million people came to the streets, and the martyrdom of Bobby Sands, on the Christian side of things, was a huge game changer. Well, the Mujahideen, like, literally raising an army to fight the communists was a huge deal. That changed everything. And finally, and kind of most significant in terms of perception of the quote unquote Muslim is this kind of savage, you know, um, dangerous actor. The Grand Mosque in Saudi Arabia on the 20th November of '79. Okay, so just like on the heels of both the Iranian Revolution, and only about half a decade after the OPEC embargo crisis, these guys identifying themselves as the tribe of Otaiba, specifically the Al Ikhwan of the tribe of Otaiba. It's like was basically they were saying that like they were like the true Arab Bedouins, and the true followers of Muhammad, uncorrupted by urban living. Like we're literally the wanderers of the desert, who are like the sword of Islam. Okay, they stormed the Grand Mosque, the holiest Islamic site in Mecca. For those who don't know, um, they slaughtered a bunch of people. They took dozens of hostages. And their leader was this wild-eyed, wild-haired ex-soldier, um, who and he issued this statement about how the Saudis they're bedding down with infidels. They're allowing Christian barbarians, the dirty like the soil of the prophet walked upon. They're bringing secularism into Saudi society. Down with the House of Assad. Like down with America. Death to America. And he cited as authority these Salafi texts that nobody had thought of in centuries, other than the most like obscure kind of Islamic scholars. His name is Johanan al-Khattabi. He's kind of forgotten now. He's been overshadowed by kind of other personages who stand in for him. But he, in my opinion, Johanan al-Khattabi, he kind of became the face of the dangerous kind of like mad Arab terrorist. And this was kind of the birth of Salafism, it's kind of like an animating principle for guys who wanted something to attach themselves to sort of strike back at what they perceived as the enemy. But again, this is basically the descendants of these guys like the Takfiri types, running around or killing other Muslims in theater in Iraq when things get bad there. They're the kinds of guys who click up with ISIS. Like these are not these guys are genuine lunatics. Like they're not. There's not some cope. Like this is not the mainstream of Islam. I mean, these guys are genuine cranks. These are the guys too who their descendants, their spiritual and ideological descendants, who Israel and America go to when they want to when they want to implement a detonation strategy. For example, like in Syria, in Iraq, many on Russia's frontier, as it were. But that's kind of when this emerged into kind of like the public mind, like in the West. Now, of course, there was this problem with needing to shore up public support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and the Reagan administration couldn't go too hard on like an anti-Islamic an Islamic tenor for obvious reasons. But these Nazi actors like the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, like the PLO, like the original Islamic Jihad, they came to be even like Iranians themselves, even though they had nothing to do with these people, in ethnic or sectarian terms. The people I just mentioned, the groupings I just mentioned, they came to be identified with this type, this violent, primitive, kind of a Arab madman who seems like he's right out of the Old Testament, and who God, would command all, pious Christians to do away with in the name of Christ, as well as in the name of, all that is good. That's kind of the starting point. And I think with respect to the neocon vision, things didn't develop the way they thought they would. And it's interesting. I got when you read stuff like Wesley Clark, who was a real a grotesque person, but he's eminently quotable because it's kind of unbelievable the arrogance and stupidity of somebody who had basically was a public figure for the entirety of his adult life. But that kind of famous speech, I think it was when he was talking to the Project for New American Century. He's like, we need to smash about half a dozen, Muslim countries in a year. He goes on the list of like Syria, like Iran, Iraq, Lebanon. I don't think he believed that was possible. What he thought would happen, I think they thought that the way the battlefield situation would develop was that basically you'd have regimes like what remained of like Saddam's Ba'ath regime. You'd have regimes like Assad's government in Syria, which was not nearly as robust as they predicted it was. You'd have you'd have the Shiite controlled districts, essentially under Hezbollah in the Levant. They thought that these people would like hold on. They thought there'd be way more of a united front than there was between these factions. They thought that these kinds of governments in situ would play way more of a role in the resolution and the conduct of conflict. And they thought that basically the war would proceed like a lot more conventionally, and so it would be kind of like manageable, yet also, they're intense enough that it warranted, it warranted kind of the maintenance of a permanent emergency footing, but predictably so. And if you look at kind of like how people were the kind of stuff that these war college types were writing about, I think that's basically like what they thought would happen, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense in absolute terms, but with the kind of bounded rationality of what they were thinking, I think it does. And Rumsfeld's note too, his memo about like doing this quote on the cheap, that only really makes sense too when you consider what I just described. Like Rumsfeld was basically saying was that we're fine with kind of like an ongoing level of active hostility so long as it's kind of below like threshold X. And I mean, there's a political aspect to that that's purposeful. I mean, obviously, trying to like manage a conflict like that, trying to like manage a forest fire, but I mean, I stand by that assessment. But that's forgive me, that was a bit scattershot, but that's what I believe is kind of the lore of it and like how like the lore tracks. If that makes any sense.
No, that makes sense. I think that, and this is what's interesting to me in a broader picture, right? Is look, like there are very few of us, Thomas, yourself not included, that have been right-wing dissidents for all that long, right? If you've been here for 10 years, you're considered kind of an old head. And
right.
So, a lot of people come here by way of being quote unquote normal Republican types. And look, like I'm certainly in that box to one degree or another. But I think that, as much as we've done as a loose group to kind of demolish those priors, when it comes to the civil rights regime, when it's come to, any number of topics, it's interesting to see how deep that pro-Israel programming is. And I think that, we talked about this earlier with, the kind of, shall we say, overworked moral language you see in regards to this. But it's interesting to see how many people are dissident-esque, connected to us maybe one or two steps away, who bought this whole new line about, the greatest tragedy since the Holocaust, hook, line, and sinker. And look, some of the legislation, I believe the House has passed it, it's going to the Senate now, which effectively makes anti-Semitism illegal, right? And we won't go into the bill per se, but what is defined as anti-Semitism is, for instance, saying something like the Jews killed Jesus, which is just in the Bible, or saying, things like, Israel is committing genocide. Those are both considered anti-Semitic. And to see, one, the immense amount of support that got, but two, how many people who would be described as our friends, just a few short months ago, have gone along with that. I think it is interesting to see that that PSYOP basically just worked.
Well, it's insane too how, the fact that it's inconceivable that any other distributed population would even think of, it'd be unthinkable for any other discrete population in political terms to be forwarding bills that make it a crime to criticize them. Like, that's literally insane. And that's why I'm always going back to, anybody who doesn't see this as a natural slave. Like, when I was at VDare, this guy, he was a bit drunk, so I'm not, I don't begrudge people things they say, when they're a bit intoxicated, but he was kind of like lipping off about blacks, and and he was trying to kind of get me into the conversation, which I had no interest in joining. And I'm like, I don't have any problem with blacks. My only ops are Zionists. And it's like, this seemed like melt his mind or something. I'm like, well, why would I be like thinking about black people? It's like, yeah, blacks have their problems. Like, yeah, there's definitely like the conditions by which we live among each other have been perverted, by the revolutionary conditions that we've been availed to. But like, why? First of all, it's like I don't hate anybody, because that's fucked up, and it just makes you like a weirdo. But secondly, like, why would I be sitting around like hating black people? Like, it's if your whole thing is that like you're fine with like Zionist rule, but you want like some law saying that you can purge your town of like black folks, like you're completely twisted in terms of your priorities. And or you're just like trying to strike some kind of hard pose because you realize you're basically like you're basically you're basically a slave to what amounts to an ethno-sectarian overcast. But yeah, I don't it's one of the things I'm always saying is that we choose you, and dissident terms, you don't choose us. One of the reasons like I ride under Third Reich stuff, it's not something it's cool and like I like rock and roll and stuff like that. That's a big part of it, but it's also like a good like filtering mechanism. If you're like terrified of the swastika, but you like love to sit around like telling N-word jokes, like you're a punk. Like you're not built for this. You're some bougie guy who's like freaked out by diversity. And I'm not saying you should like diversity, but like you know what I mean. Like you're perfectly okay with like being a second-class citizen in your own country.
So one of the things that you hear, and I won't name names here, but you certainly hear it, is this idea that, well, if we support the Zionists now, if we support Israel, well, they will pay us back for that. I think that is completely and totally retarded. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that idea?
That's like some guy going to like getting locked in prison and saying he's gonna pay all the predators like cigarettes to not like fuck him up the ass. Like it's like it's that pathetic. But it's also like why are we trying to like buy off our enemies? And it's like why would I dislike Muslims? And not only do I not dislike Muslims, they're some of my best comrades. I'm like I'm supposed to like approach my enemies and be like, I'm gonna support you in like assaulting these people en masse, pursuant to some imaginary like theological mandate you have to wage Rosenkrieg. And like if I beg you enough, you'll like quote support me and my ambitions. Plus, too, it's like anybody who thinks that way is stepping on their own dick. Again, my only ops are Zionists. I'm not gonna like pay my enemies to try. I'm not gonna attempt to buy off my enemies and not be my enemies so that they'll quote support me doing what? Like what do I need to support in doing? I mean, that's so fucking twisted and confused. I don't even know where to start.
Well, in addition to that, right, we've seen this experiment run before. We've seen this trialed for what, the last 50 years. And, look, like I get it, people are coming into politics at different times. But at the same time, it's like, look, man, you're not the first person to try and do this. You're not. And it doesn't work. And I think that it's also interesting because if you look at the organized Palestinian protest, right, what groups are involved in that? A lot of them do receive funding from the Israeli government. And if you look at what those groups promote, it is basically, you shouldn't worry about Zionists. And eagle-eyed viewers will know exactly what I mean by that term Zionist, right, in this context. They're not your enemies. It's really, the white Western world. It's England, it's America. And at the same time, to American conservative types, they're saying, Zionists aren't your real enemy. It's, people who live in Rafah. They're the real problem. And once you kind of zoom out and look at both sides of this, you've got to understand that, even if it's, kind of the gay and natural slave, inclination to kind of make peace with your predator. But also, this is not a good faith interaction, right? They are not looking at this like a deal between equals. You're effectively, the best situation you can get is to be the most favored coolie, right? To be the house slave. And I don't want to live like that.
No. Well, that's why, I mean, the point I made about, it's the one I made about, like, when people present questions to me, like, do you, quote, deny the Holocaust? It's like, why are Zionist concerns, like, always central to any historical consideration? Like, why are like, organized Jewish interests and organized, like, Zionist interests, like, these are always, like, predicate to, like, any political question that's, like, raised? Like, why does political life, like, orbit around, like, Zionist concerns and interests? And, I mean that these are the kinds of questions people should be asking themselves. And it's like, and even if I mean, the point to do some idiot the other day was like calling me names, and all kinds of other things, which was whatever. I don't care if if people say like I look like a quote troon, I take that to mean it's because like I've got good hair and I'm not a fat fuck, and they are. And if they say I'm like a clown, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, clowns are pretty dope. They entertain people and they do crazy things. But so I don't run from that. But because it may, like he was saying, he was saying like, oh, these people are like, these are your friends, bro. And he's like posting pics of like some like BLM people at like a pro-Palestine rally. I'm like, okay, man, like it's like, do you realize that the IWW and the Communist Party USA like backed like the non-aggression pact and like superficially backed Hitler? So does that mean like Hitler was like a purple-haired like communist who like believed in like radical feminism? I mean, like it's like, what am I supposed to take away from that? I mean, like even these people weren't essentially proxies of Zionist NGOs anyway, who are like being put out there to essentially compromise the optics of what does constitute the actual pro-Palestine cadre on the ground here. But like even if it was like totally a spontaneous thing, it's like that means what? Like so that means that that means that Hezbollah are a bunch of LGBTQ like fat kids. Like what is it? I don't even understand what the point is there. Like what is being asserted. I think it's truly that much of a dummy fucking half literate take, and it's why allowing, I mean, it's evidence of why like teaching most people to read is like a crime. But I realize I'm ranting.
No, it's funny. I hadn't heard you say that before, but I find myself in complete agreement. One of the things that I think is broadly interesting about this, and look, American conservatives are the designated jobbers of politics here, right? They are losers. And one of the things that you've noticed is that, broadly speaking, public opinion is not pro-Israel at the moment. Yeah, I was down doing some corporate travel, trying my best to keep my spaghetti in my pocket and be normal, and
Yeah.
watching some sports. And it's interesting. There are a ton of ads, stop anti-Semitism, support Israel, like very, very prominently displayed on national sporting events. And that's a weird thing, right? That was
Yep.
not the case 10, 20 years ago because it didn't need
Oh
to.
no.
And so I think that speaks to one of the white pills in this, is that they are not in a good situation. Obviously
not
it
at
seems
all.
like the IDF is rolling into Rafah and is just going to clear people out. But if we look at the international scene, effectively it is only the US, the UK, which is basically they
Airstrip
don't have
one.
their own
Yeah.
foreign policy, and then Switzerland. And I assume we just kind of pointed a gun at Switzerland and said, all right, you've got to go with us on this one, who are blocking international level sanctions of Israel, right? We are the only ones vetoing that on the national or the Security Council. And
No, and
so
I
when you
guarantee.
look at that
Oh, go ahead.
broadly, and I'll throw it back to you after this,
Yeah.
opinion is not on these people's side. They sort of are, obviously they have an immense amount of power, but very, very limited goodwill from really anyone other than like these insane, like natural slaves.
No, 100%. And it's also, I mean, if public opinions are metric and just sort of sentiment of the body politic writ large, they've got a bigger problem than it seems like, man. It's like Robert Cahaley, was like talks about a lot. He's a guy. He's not real prolific these days, but he's a statistician and things. And he made the point when there's all these dummy takes on unconventional polling that were being kind of bandied. He said, "Look, he's like, do you really think that that most people, if some like random stranger calls them and says, 'Hi, I'm so and so from like XYZ, data management. We do you intend to vote for Mr. Trump, in November?' Like, whose business is that? You're gonna talk to strangers, like who call you at dinner time and tell them who you plan to vote for, particularly if the man in question is somebody who's been held out as this kind of controversial figure, and where people are, from what I've heard, like people, like lose their jobs these days over Facebook posts and things. It's like, you really think people are going to be honest about that? Like if like you were with your old lady and like walking through a college campus and some like random guy comes with a clipboard and is like, "Hi, what's your name? Like, what do you think of Israel?" Like, what the fuck are you going to say to him? You're going to be like, "Get the fuck out of my face." You know what I mean? Like, there's no way there's no way people are gonna answer that in good faith. And like those that do, I mean, how representative are they? To your point, they're people who probably go to some like weirdo mega church type deal that basically exists to kind of promote like raise goyish money for the Zionist state. I mean, how could we even gauge this effectively in terms of coding it into inputs? But yeah, no, even in the last 10 years, support for Israel is plummeted. It's obvious. It's all around us within the zeitgeist.
So I'm curious, and this is not something I gave you to prepare, but what do you see as the future of the state of Israel? Obviously the Likud party is in a bad situation, but what does the next 10 years look like for my personal favorite country?
The vanguard, the demographic vanguard, interestingly, is going to become the people who are referred to as the quote ultra orthodox, and that's going to be an interesting thing, because those people are extraordinarily like racial in their thinking. They're obviously extraordinarily committed to what they view as pious Judaism. They're not Zionists in the sense that like Likud are. They come from very different places. Um, so as those people gain more clout, you're gonna see in Israel as both like more religious and more extreme on theological matters, but that's less hardline on kind of like secular racialist matters and on maintenance of grand apartheid. It's going to be strange. Okay, that's my take on it. How we get to that point, um, is there going to be some giant bloodbath whereby just, like a General Rosenkrieg breaks out between Dar al-Islam and Israel? I don't think we're there yet, but certainly nothing's impossible. I think something that's not being talked about is the internal situation in Egypt, as well as what happens, like how the Turks proceed on this, and also what develops between Russia and Ukraine. If Israel might start thinking really, they might start contemplating measures that would heretofore be unthinkable. But I don't know. But that's my take on it. And I need more time to kind of think it through.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I kind of put you on the
No,
spot
no, no.
there.
Don't be sorry at all.
One of the things I think is interesting, and this is one of those topics like the war in Ukraine that you have to be very, very cautious on your sourcing. And I've been listening more to Judge Napolitano, who's funny. It's right. The guy's like in his late 70s, kind of New Jersey Republican type. And
Yeah.
I've never seen someone get radicalized so quickly. He's basically just like openly saying things about Zionists, shall we say. And I'm being cautious because I got a YouTube strike last week, so you have to read between the lines there. Basically, just like naming them, on a normal.
I didn't really know anything about him. Like, yeah, our buddy Pete knows him, I guess. And he reminds me of Paul Sorvino's character in Goodfellas, just by like looking at him. Like
he totally does.
Yeah. So he seems like this like mob guy or something. I mean, I'm not making fun of him. That's funny. But I know that more and more people have been citing him. Well, just the fact that we get your point.
The reason that I bring it up is that one of the things that he always talks about, and we have to be cautious, right? Because a lot of the people on his show are quote unquote ex-CIA connected, right? So
Sure.
you have to take everything with a grain of salt. But one of the things they mention is that Netanyahu personally is in a very dangerous situation.
Oh,
the
huge.
Likud party is sort of seeing challenges across the board. And so he's sort of stuck in an uncomfortable coalition where he is under personal indictment for any number of things. He has been kind of granted a reprieve by the fact there is a state of emergency, which is, let's be honest, sort of typical for the nation of Israel. But also he's had to form a coalition with more and more extreme Zionist parties.
No, I made that point. That's the only thing keeping him afloat. I remain shocked, and I wrote about this some weeks back, that he said he wasn't sandbagged after the idea was literally caught sleeping on October 7th, when Hamas elements initially breached the barrier fence. But yeah, the only thing keeping Netanyahu not just in the seat of power, but in the free world is this war. And it's in his interest to prolong it as long as possible. And yeah, to your point, and to apparently Judge Napolitano's point, Netanyahu clicking up with the most extreme elements of the war party, not just within the Knesset, but without. I'm talking about people who generally aren't playing the game above board. Yeah, this is a very dangerous situation, and you're absolutely right.
So I have absolutely no idea where this goes from here. I think that one of the interesting things to note is that it seems like Trump has sort of cooled on Netanyahu personally. We'll see where that goes. Like I said, I have no opinions whatsoever on the 2024 election, right? I assume it will be even fairer and freer than last time. But it does seem like, and this is why I think Judge Napolitano and his guests are an interesting data point, because let's be honest, they are all CIA connected. And it seems like they are basically looking at Israel as a bad deal for them. Like, why are we, why do we have to be tied to essentially this like rabid dog, antagonizing the entire world?
I will say this though, to your point, and this might provide some insight. What I can say is that the intelligence establishment, even the Department of State, which is pretty much since Baker left, it's the Department of State's been co-opted. I mean, the Department of State's like a joke. It's cringe anytime those people open their mouths. But post Baker, because traditionally the State Department was viewed as like quote unquote Arabist and like anti-Semitic. They're pretty much unfailingly pro-Israel since 1993. And they've always been uncomfortable with Likud, in part because, of course, like Yitzhak Rabin was their guy, And I believe it's pretty clear he was murdered by, I'm not saying like Likud like got together in a smoke-filled room and deployed an assassin to murder him, but I think it's pretty clear that, Barak's murder and the ascendancy of Likud were, or Rabin's murder and the ascendancy of Likud were not just like accidental things. And Ehud Barak is worth listening to on this point. But I believe the answer to what you're saying or what you're asking is that, yeah, I think that Likud is being used as an alibi to some degree. Definitely by some of these people of the sort who associate with Napolitano, but also by other people who are kind of putting on a very critical font on the discussion of what Israel is doing. But again, I think when Netanyahu is gone, they're going to say, "Oh, that was we were being misled by that bad man, and now we know better. Let's learn from our mistakes." And no way in hell are we going to compromise the posterity of the Jewish state, which is first, last, and always, a Jewish racial state.
So, Thomas, we are fast coming up on time. If people want to find more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
Yeah, I've been directing people to my website mostly. It's Thomas777.com, number 7, HMAS777.com. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter, capital REAL _ number 7 HMAS 777. I'm on Telegram, though lately I haven't been really active. I've got a YouTube channel I'm trying to populate with more stuff. My health hasn't been great lately, as I'm sure people can hear my voice, but I think I'm on the mend. That's basically where you can find me. I'm trying to get the handle on this damn manuscript. And I think I'll have something good by fall. But yeah, that's where I'm at. And thanks so much for hosting me, man.
Well, thank you very much, man. I always enjoy talking to you. As far as my stuff, you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, at least for now, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I have a Substack, new article coming out there sooner or later. And stay tuned for the rest of this series on Israel Palestine. Should be a good episode. And again, Thomas, thanks for coming on, man.
Thank you, man.
One more thing, if you want to support us, best way to do that is to head over to Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. High quality stuff there. More and more guys are joining it. The group chat is getting bigger and bigger and more unmanageable. Highly likely to see you there. And again, to everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.